It's the exact same groups pushing these laws and pushing these bills, and they're opportunistically using a case of an evangelical therapist and trans kids, right, as an access point to upend all LGBTQ rights. So these aren't new independent groups who are just coming for trans rights. These are the same groups that want to upend all our rights, working tactfully to pretend like they're isolating trans rights to get more of the public on board.
Hello, welcome to Secular Spotlight. I'm Nancy Noet. I'm a staff attorney here with the Freedom from Religion Foundation, and I am here with
Matt Kenyon, FFRF's Director of First Impressions and the Facilities Manager here at Free Thought Hall.
Okay, so we're going to get right into this with our guest, Spencer Macnaughton, founder and editor-in-chief of Uncloseted Media, a website that focuses on LGBTQ plus focused accountability in journalism. A lot of great content there. We're hoping, obviously, we'll check it out, and hopefully Spencer can encourage you further to do that. He worked previously at a number of fantastic organizations, including 60 Minutes, the Wall Street Journal. There are several to add to that, and he can add them too if he'd like, but in the spirit of moving through things, obviously, he is now primarily with his website, although he does also teach journalism at NYU. So welcome, Spencer. Thanks for being here.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm really excited to be here with you guys.
Okay, great. And we're excited, as I said, to have you. So one thing I'd like to get into, and I got this off of your website, so I'm going to have a little quote. I think it's a nice introduction. You mentioned, you started this website because of, quote, the need for rigorous, nonpartisan journalism about the LGBTQ plus community, and that need has never been greater. But let's talk a little bit, if it's okay, about the history here, because there's been a deficit, I think, and I assume you'll agree with me, but perhaps not, in the journalism space anyway, with respect to news and information about our community. What does the mainstream media get wrong about covering LGBTQ plus issues?
Yeah, that is a big question and a complicated question. And I would say, as somebody who has worked in mainstream media, like you mentioned at the Wall Street Journal and 60 Minutes, a variety of other places, I think sometimes the public is too hard on the mainstream media. I don't necessarily think they're getting a ton wrong. I think it's the lack of reporting they do on LGBTQ stories. So I remember when I'd work at, WSJ, for example, and I would pitch really important LGBTQ focused stories constantly because I knew they were undertold, I knew they were underreported, and I knew they were newsworthy. And, the pushback or the lack of excitement about those pitches was so obvious unless it was Pride Month, and they said, let's do, the one-off, let's get our gay journalists to do a one-off on pink washing for the 19th time because it's Pride Month, But I knew from previous reporting I had done on far-right extremism that there was a massive anti-LGBTQ ecosystem that was alive and very well in the United States particularly, that just was going left unspoken about to a large extent. And, for example, I looked at this Christian legal group that you guys are probably aware of, Alliance Defending Freedom. And they're massive. They are so well funded. They are so deep when it comes to education, expertise, and they actually get things done in courtrooms, not only nationally, but internationally as well, across the country and across the globe. And when I looked into them, there had been so little deep, rigorous journalism on that group that it was shocking. They've been around since 1994. They've been influential since 1994. So I pitched that story to Rolling Stone and then did kind of a long form piece on that. And that got out there. But I think what they're getting wrong is the necessity and the urgency of how many stories need to be told consistently with depth, rather than just a headline that, Trump blocked trans people from the military. Let's have 6 talking heads, 3 from each side, debate, and then we move on to the next thing. And that's a bit because there's a relentless news cycle. And I think a lack of awareness from the producers and the executives in these newsrooms from recognizing how powerful and dangerous these groups are. Because unlike the Ku Klux Klan, unlike the Boogaloo Boys, unlike the Proud Boys, who were often lost little boys in basements, these people in America's anti-LGBTQ ecosystem are often just Christian legal groups who are the epitome of wolves in sheep's clothing, and you can't ID them as easily.
So in that vein, that's a question that came up for me, is even if you're objectively reporting about our community, it seems to me that you face a wall, if you will, because there's this perception. They twist a story about the LGBT community, they being often the religious right, but other venues as well. Often those stories, however objective, are perceived as anti-religion or somehow interfering with religious freedom. So, objective reporting comes up against that kind of view. They're already looking at you as fake news. How do you deal with that when you're just trying to get a story out to cover something objectively that's happening in the community?
Yes, that's a great question. And I studied journalism at Columbia. That's what brought me here from Canada 11 years ago. And it's called a Master's of Science in Journalism. And I love that it's called a Master's of Science because I really believe there's a science to journalism and to telling truth. And I believe that journalistic balance should be a reflection of methodologically sound, evidence-based research. I think that's as close as you can get to objectivity and truth in this world, right? But I think maybe back to your question on the mainstream media, there's this warped sense of balance, especially in 2025, especially in the new Trump administration, where, it's viewpoint discrimination. If you don't represent a side that is deeply religious and they believe that homosexuality is a sin, or that conversion therapy should be legal, or that trans people should not exist. And I think because of the political pressures that are seeping down to mainstream media, the media is now taking on this new definition of balance where those homophobic, transphobic viewpoints that are just, masquerading through religion and Christianity are almost becoming half the truth according to them. And I think that's extremely dangerous.
So in a lot of ways, it's very similar to we have to hear both sides, regardless of how ridiculous one side may or may not be.
Exactly. And I tell, the journalists I work with or people who might push back on me saying, oh, this story wasn't done with the balance that it warrants. I said, literally just, put the word homosexual and trans and substitute it for black or brown or any racial minority group, right? It's the same thing. And there is, I believe, still a double standard when it comes to gay and trans and LGBTQ issues, because of this get out of jail free card that religious freedom seems to still have in the United States. And most of the time that's through the lens of far right Christianity.
So let's be even more pointed than that. And because you kind of got to that point, and I think it's a good one. Why us? Like, I knew with this incoming administration, Project 2025, I knew that the target was literally on my back and everybody else in the community. They were coming for us, and they sure are. Why? And this isn't brand new. Like, throughout history, our community has been one that makes a good target, so to speak, for this kind of conservative and specifically often religious attack. Why is that? Why us?
I think because when you look at Christianity, it's what these people really believe. They really believe. There are so many Americans who believe that homosexuality is a sin, that transgender people don't exist or aren't a real thing, and that any action on that, is immoral and sinful and disordered and unnatural, right? And I think that it's easier for it to be us because the Bible to some people is interpreted that way, right? And that's different than most minority groups. I think women are also really targets of religion through, a lot of denominations of Christianity promote patriarchal governance structures, for example. I think Project 2025 promotes that a lot. But I think, women and queer people are the targets because of the history, the way religion in, the US, specifically Christianity, has been perceived and interpreted.
Is it also about more? Because I looking at one of the articles you have, a good one on your website, Ari Shaw talks about a 2023 research paper tying Christian nationalism, attacking LGBTQ rights, and being the first pillar in destroying civil rights for everybody. I sort of feel like that too. You take the low-hanging fruit, pick it, and smash it, and then it's a building block further to, keep the rich, straight, cis, white guys in power and power. I mean, that's kind of always what it's been about. And that's how it feels to me. Do you share that viewpoint? Is it something you see in your work on the website, or am I just maybe getting a little bit out there on the soapbox too much?
No, I mean, I think what you're saying is definitely valid. I maybe wouldn't opine on that personally so much because I'm not sure how I feel personally about that one. But I think that a lot of what you look at with Project 2025 is, the reinforcement of patriarchy, of white nationalism, of Christian nationalism. I mean, there's a lot of overlap in that document to what the Ku Klux Klan believes. I embedded with the Ku Klux Klan. I spent 2 weeks with them in Georgia and North Carolina. And a lot of what they say is very similar in that, there should be supremacy for a subset of people in the United States, and that other people, the weakest links, should not have the same rights, and should be punished and should, not be able to engage in democracy in the same way as other people. So I think there's a ton of overlap. And when Ari Shah said that in that article, it didn't surprise me that LGBTQ rights were the first to go. No.
I'm interested, as the person who answers the phones and deals with most of the emails that come into the company. I often hear things like, well, LGBTQ right issues aren't church and state issues. But as we're seeing here in our conversation, these two are so intertwined. And clearly, you guys found that as well, because on Uncloseted Media, you have a whole section based purely on religious stories. So I guess I'm curious, as I step back from the details of the conversation, how did you guys end up doing so much religious story that you ended up making a page just about religion? Like, do you see this connection between church state the same way that and LGBTQ rights issues the same way we do?
Yeah, I mean, so much, like in the United States, so much of the homophobia, so much of the transphobia, so much of the hate is religion. And we actually had that page when we launched because I kind of knew that going into it, that, the hate groups are Christian legal groups, or evangelical groups, or all these things. I couldn't care less about what they think in their personal lives about religion. But if you're preaching hate, it's still hate, even if there's religion attached to it, And I think the thing that I've learned, at least in doing, I'm not a lawyer, but in doing a lot of reporting on these groups, is that freedom of religion laws in this country is what screws LGBTQ people so often, because it's just this constant get out of jail free card. We did a story on conversion therapy laws and how it's been banned in 23 states or something like that, which may change depending on what the Supreme Court does. But no clue that only applied to licensed therapists, that religious leaders had a get out of jail free card for that and could still practice on kids of any age nationwide, and they can still do that to this day. And I think we had some stat in that article where 85% of conversion therapy practitioners are religious leaders, aren't licensed therapists. So you see all these headlines of conversion therapy is now illegal in another state. And it's like, well, not really, So yeah, I mean, I just think every story that we do just seems to come back to this Christian extremism nearly every time, the more we do it. So yeah, that page gets fuller and fuller.
And it reminds me, I know that your partner wrote a very moving article that you published on your website about the religious trauma he's been through and how much he would have benefited. And I share this, by the way, not the trauma part, thankfully, as much, but growing up, and I'm going to age myself a little bit here, but I didn't have anything like this. Kids in my high school weren't out. I knew I was a member of the community, but I couldn't be out about it. And there were no websites like this. We hardly had computers. But aside from that, there weren't resources like that. And of course, it does make a big difference. And then circling back to kind of your point, the religious trauma piece. This morning, I was talking with a colleague preparing for this interview. And I said, it's interesting, there is so much religious trauma, and what in the name of religion, what kind of damage is done to so many people, especially young people. And that was certainly true for your partner. And I asked the question, I said, when was the last time you heard about an atheist traumatizing their children about not believing in God? Or better still, when was the first time? And I'm not trying to defend the two groups necessarily, but so much damage is done in the name of religion. And your partner spoke about that. And so my question is just one, I mean, is that a focus in particular for you on the website? being that kind of resource in particular for kids, and especially kids, like the conversion therapy nightmare. And we can talk more about that if you'd like. Is that a particular focus on the website? And if so, how do you try to reach those kids and adults who are so desperate for just hope, honestly?
I think America has a youth mental health crisis as it is, but we have a massive queer youth mental health crisis. Roughly 40% of LGBTQ kids in the US seriously considered suicide in the last year. That's an epidemic to me. That's a massive, massive problem. And I used to work at Nickelodeon News too, so I've done a lot of work with kids. And the more queer people you meet, the more trauma you hear about. And it almost always goes back to some kind of religious trauma, some kind of religious rejection from family because of their interpretation of the Bible. You rarely hear people talk about trauma as a queer person for just, a parent who hates gay people for no good reason. It's almost always because it's a sin, because it's disordered, and for Sean, this Uncloseted Media is personal for me. I grew up in a liberal bubble in Toronto, to an actor mom and a professor dad, and came out at 16, and it wasn't perfect, but it was pretty easy, relatively speaking. And I heard about people really struggling and, met a lot of people like that. But obviously Sean's the person who's closest to me. He's my boyfriend. We've been dating for a few years, and, he has no contact with his parents. His parents are still extremely religious. It was all, they were homeschooled. They lived in the woods for a year because God told them to do that. These sorts of things. And Sean was subjected to corporal punishment. He was, completely rejected by his mom. He remembers his mom telling him on the day he came out to her that him coming out to her as gay is the equivalent to him getting run over in a car accident and not surviving, and he just learned, when you learn in church, in school, in at family dinners, where is safe? Your hometown, your school, your bedroom, your church, none of that is safe. Of course, that's going to yield trauma, And so today he struggles, and he openly struggles. He wrote about it in the article with depression, with anxiety, with debilitating tics. He has a psychiatric service dog, He's one of the anomalies who left his small town of North Carolina at 18, got on SNAP benefits in New York City, got into Section 8 housing, and now at 40 years old, he's completely self-made and has made it out. Most people understandably aren't that strong, but you're living in a world where it's just hate, rejection. It's not surprising that roughly 40% of LGBTQ kids are thinking about killing themselves. And I think it's something we will never be able to talk enough about, and we need solutions. And I'm not sure what they are, but I think there needs to be an examination of these extreme denominations of Christianity because it's killing people. I believe that. And it's killing kids.
Does that play into your motivation to start Uncloseted Media and the goals that you have in mind for Uncloseted Media? Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, I definitely did. I think Sean and I were kind of beginning to date, and I was still at Nickelodeon, and he was talking about religious trauma, and I'm like, that's interesting. I want to write a story about that. And I looked it up, and one of the biggest studies that been done on it, and this stat shocked me. I still almost don't believe it. 1 in 3 Americans have experienced religious trauma at some point in their life, I believe. 1 in 3. Crazy. So, I wrote a story and met people who had gone through that. And that was a huge kind of motivating factor, and almost like a clarifying factor of how much Uncloseted Media was needed, because I knew how many little Seans were out there. And so that kind of really propelled me to say, okay, this is not just, urgent, it's critical to do right now, because there is a huge gap, as we mentioned, in mainstream, but also, queer media right now, most of it is for profit. And if you know anything about journalism, it's very hard to get a return on investment on investigative journalism. So I knew we could really fill a gap as a nonprofit newsroom in this space. And that is a goal, is to expose these groups and these people, these bad actors who are creating a system that is so dangerous for LGBTQ rights and also just queer people in general, and then also give a space to uplift the voices. Sean's story really inspired. His DMs were flooded. He got so many messages. He really turned in overnight into a leader in that space. And he's talked actually about how it's almost helped him heal a little bit to be able to tell his story and have it out there and hear from other people. So even if it's a community space where people are healing together, that's a beautiful part of Uncloseted Media too, because we uplift those voices in addition to investigating the hate.
I think a segue from religious trauma at home. Kids and some adults are facing it elsewhere too, and it comes courtesy these days, and especially this last term, of our Supreme Court. And you spoke of Alliance Defending Freedom earlier, and their agenda in basically erasing whatever they can of our community. They seem to have a red carpet that leads directly to the Supreme Court's front steps. They have access to the Supreme Court that I think is unprecedented, and they're obtaining rulings that are just gutting every step forward almost that we've made in our community. Most recently, you can look at the Scrimeti case. So now trans kids are struggling more and more to get very much needed both mental health and actual health care and transition care. Child's is another one. The decision's not out yet, but I think the writing is on the wall. Conversion therapy, no problem. Go ahead and do it. It's an abomination, but it's coming. And this is filtering then down into the schools. Mahmoud is another one, and that was an Alliance Defending Freedom case, where parents are now, they can opt their kids out of reading exercises if there happens to be an LGBTQ plus character in a book. Where are we going here? I mean, you cover a lot of this on the website. I mean, where does this end, and how do we hang in there and have hope in this day and age when it's not just the community, it's not just at home, it's all the way up at the Supreme Court, rolling things out and saying like, yeah, no, this is great.
That is a really hard question.
Yes, it is.
It's really scary, honestly. Like you said, with Alliance Defending Freedom, because they're so strategic, so smart, and they're constantly, I think one thing that people need to know is they're constantly litmus testing things too. They're seeing how far they can push anti-LGBTQ bills in, states and deep red states. Does it pass there? Can we move it to this court? And they do get rejected quite a bit, but they keep knifing their way in there by just constantly trying and putting pressure on. And then they get all the way up to the Supreme Court in many cases. And often they're successful. How do we, solve it? Where does it end? I don't know. I believe in the power of storytelling, and I still think there's not nearly enough out there. I think you see Kristen Waggoner, the president of Alliance Defending Freedom, going on CNN looking like she's going to bake you an apple pie in a suburb, and they aren't, pressing her and letting people know that this is a Southern Poverty Law Center anti-LGBTQ hate group. They are not just against, trans kids who are questioning from getting conversion therapy. They have advocated in favor of sodomy laws, in favor of conversion therapy, against gay marriage. They were founded by somebody who wrote a book called The Homosexual Agenda, and they litigate in Eastern Europe, Africa, and all over the world to try and roll back anti-LGBTQ rights. And if mainstream media isn't saying that every time Kristen Waggoner goes on their TV, that's a huge problem, because it makes it look like this is a trustworthy, well-to-do woman who really cares about protecting children and parents' rights and all these dog whistles that are frankly BS, and just smart ways for people to say, let's greenlight and legalize hating gay people and trans people. And it really works. They've really taken America and manipulated them by the weaponization of Christianity.
So, I mean, that's a point that I'd like to follow up on. I mean, like you say, if mainstream media is not calling them out, they're not. I don't think, and I'm curious to know, I know you've done some investigative reporting on the funding and the network, frankly, that Alliance Defending Freedom, Liberty Counsel, they're not just a small group of lawyers that, oh, shucks, occasionally we have a plaintiff here or there and then we file a lawsuit. They're big organizations and they stretch far and wide. Has your reporting on that, are you getting some ears? Are people listening? Are people paying attention when they hear about what these organizations actually are about and what they're doing? Or is that falling on deaf ears?
No, it's working. It's working. And a big part of how it's working is I realized launching Uncloseted Media is we needed to break out of the queer echo chamber, right? Because, the three of us obviously understand this. A lot of people who digest a lot of LGBTQ news get this. But, a big goal is for us to get republished by mainstream publications. So I don't know if you remember when there were resolutions, I think in February, that were being placed in state legislatures to overturn gay marriage. Idaho was the first state to do that. And we did a joint investigation with the Idaho Statesmen into Mass Resistance, which was the group pushing these MAGA lawmakers to introduce these resolutions that would overturn gay marriage in those states. And we were then on the cover of the Idaho Statesman. And then you get lawyers reaching out, or you get politicians reaching out, or you get advocates reaching out to amplify. So we know we're having impact in that people are using some of this reporting in meaningful places. And also, we get a lot of eyeballs and get republished in a ton of places. So hopefully that spreads awareness. But it is tricky to know the bottom line impact at the end of the day, but that's why kind of the, goal number one is to get on the cover of those red and rural state publications, et cetera, because then you get to the people in that community who will have never understood that, because everywhere they go, they just think of Alliance Defending Freedom as this cute, beautiful Christian group,
We thought we had, or we celebrated a little bit of a victory when Kim Davis lost her most recent 10-year-old fight, continued petition to our Supreme Court, again, trying to go after marriage equality, Obergefell. And I think I try not to get too excited about it because frankly, it was like the worst case in the world for the Supreme Court to take up to do that. And they're going to get a lot of other opportunities. And so in terms of what you've seen, publishing resources and dealing with the community, have we gotten the response to, oh shit, we're in trouble and marriage equality really could go, is often, yeah, but I think we've come far enough and there are enough people, even religious folks, that think, well, we're going to let this one go, that we're going to be okay. And Amy Coney Barrett, I think, said something recently that got people talking about how she thinks maybe marriage equality will survive. Where do you see that on your end of things?
I see actually a split in the LGBTQ community right now in people who, who are not trans or non-binary, kind of saying things along the lines of, oh, well, we've won marriage equality. We have our rights. Let's just split this, acronym and not worry about it. Right. And I think that's a kind of shitty perspective to have personally, but people have it. And when, I even had a friend at my gym come up to me and he was saying, well, I don't want, my son dressing like a girl and had issue with transgender people and this kind of thing. And he was talking about the conversion therapy piece. And I said, but you don't understand that it's the exact same groups pushing these laws and pushing these bills. And they're opportunistically using a case of an evangelical therapist and trans kids, right, as an access point to upend all LGBTQ rights. So these aren't new independent groups who are just coming for trans rights. These are the same groups that want to upend all our rights, working tactfully to pretend like they're isolating trans rights to get more of the public on board with their efforts. And I think a lot of people don't understand that. I think they think it's like a new fight to overturn just trans rights, but Project 2025, written by the Heritage Foundation, they're in bed with Alliance Defending Freedom. They're in bed with Focus on the Family. And these people are aggressively, intensely anti-gay. And I think that, I don't know if that answers your exact question, but I think that's just an important point to make, is that like there's that split, and people are naive to think that they're mutually exclusive, because they're not.
Yeah, I often see that what I perceive is that they're coming after the whole LGBTQIA plus alphabet. They just picked the T to start with. And they're going to remove the T and then move on to the other letters in this, LGBTQIA plus. And we as members of that community should not be putting our time into helping them separate out these different letters. We need to stay as a cohesive group, is kind of what I hear you saying. And I think that's super important for us to really not just focus on inside the gay community, but as you were saying, we need this message to get outside the community that this is a cohesive community, and we're not going to let you just take one alphabet letter away at a time. Does that make sense?
1,000%. Yeah. And I think it's important for people to understand that, from their last 990, Alliance Defending Freedom, I think their revenue was $104 million. Focus on the Family, I think, is something like $100 million per their last 990 as well. So these organizations have massive amounts of money and can do massive amounts of research to find out what sticks, to really thoughtfully think of a strategy that's going to chip away at our rights. And that strategy, per, I guess, public opinion, is starting with the T. Right? But it is not exclusive. They want to find ways to knife in and find cases like in Childs where the therapist just, didn't want to treat a gender confused child because they know that's what's going to be most effective at getting it across. If it was a gay boy like Sean, who, was like, really like digestible to an American audience, if you will, then, that would break the hearts of people who really care, but they're intentionally going after the most marginalized, the most misunderstood community, and it's disgusting, but it's what's happening.
So I had down for my last question for you, and I think you've kind of answered it, but maybe you could break it down and take it to some specific points. But what is the single biggest threat to our community in 2025 and 2026 to come?
I would say is Christian extremism. I would say that. And it's not just because I'm on this podcast. I'd say that on any other podcast. I think they're so effective. They're so powerful, not just in one domain either. They smartly, if you read our article on Liberty Council's network of faith, I think we called it, or something like that. They have other spin-off organizations or allied organizations, and they, have organizations where they can affect education and what kids are reading in schools. They have organizations trying to rile up conservative women to get women on their side. They are in Israel randomly. They are very much embedded in the law. They're embedded with the Supreme Court in certain cases. They're all over the place, and they are not easy to identify, if you don't know, right? Which is why this reporting is so important, to peel back the onion, because you also don't see it on mainstream media. They're not calling the Kristen Wagoners out, and she doesn't have a white hood on her head when she comes on air, so she's not as easy to identify, but we need to call it out. I mean, that's at the end of the day, our job as journalists, is to give the viewer, the reader, the context that they deserve and expect when they're turning into news, and we lack so much context about this ecosystem.
Well, this has been a fantastic conversation. Thank you so much for coming on our show, Spencer. Can you please tell our viewers where they can follow Uncloseted Media?
Absolutely. And thank you guys for having me too. Anyone who wants to read our work, our journalism, can subscribe at unclosetedmedia.com. You can also follow us on Instagram at unclosetedmedia. And yeah, we hope you learn some stuff.
Absolutely. And that's going to wrap up this week's episode of Secular Spotlight. If you'd like to support our mission, please consider being a member at FFRF.org. And please like this episode, smash the like button, subscribe to the channel if you don't. These are always important things to say. Don't miss an episode. Thanks for watching. We're going to see you next time. Thanks, Spencer.
Our legal team works every day to defend our secular constitution. We've stopped unconstitutional prayer in public schools, shut down government-funded religious programs, and much more. If you see a state church violation in your area, you can report it through our website at the link on your screen.